So June is upon us, and yeah, it's a month we often associate with, vibrant colors, celebrations all over the world.
Mhm.
But today we're taking a deep dive that asks us to maybe look a bit differently at those flags, at what they might mean, or maybe sometimes what they might hide.
That's right. We're digging into a very specific viewpoint today. It's from a text called Reclaiming Pride, Clarity in a Storm of Ideology.
Okay.
And it's written by Oliver Werner Nightinger, who also uses the name she. He's the founder of Lóng Tíng Enterprises and is himself part of the LGBTQIA+ community.
Right. And our aim here is really to unpack this author's specific perspective on where Pride Month is right now. We want to look at the emotional side, the sociopolitical stuff, and even the global picture they paint.
Yeah, and the author brings a lot of context. Decades working across cultures, building bridges. And they host these things called ER calls.
Emergency room calls, right?
Yeah, exactly. Described as a space, specifically for tackling the difficult, uncomfortable questions.
And you get that sense right from the start, don't you? The author acknowledges real progress, definitely, but then immediately flags this deep worry, this confusion.
A feeling that the community is maybe being pulled apart by ideology.
By fear. And they're very clear up front, which is important. This text isn't presented as hate.
No, not at all. It's framed as a search for clarity, a call to remember the movement's core identity, and really question where it's heading.
Yeah, and one of the author's key points about Pride's journey is interesting. They frame it as starting as protest.
Then becoming celebration.
And now, the author argues, it needs to become a conversation again, urgently.
And this deep dive, looking at their text, is kind of offered as part of starting that conversation.
Okay, so let's dive into the author's view on June today. They start by looking globally. They acknowledge that places like the Middle East, parts of Africa, the danger there for LGBTQIA+ people is still incredibly real.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the author then pivots to the West, Germany, UK, US are mentioned, and argues the challenge. There isn't so much invisibility anymore or silence. It's, well, they call it noise.
No.
Yeah, like a thunderstorm of opinion, identity, ideology, just an overwhelming amount of stuff.
And what's the core issue within that noise, according to the author?
Well, they really zero in on this strong feeling that pride in the West has become, and this is their phrase, politicized beyond recognition.
Okay, that's a strong statement.
It is. And they link it very specifically to the discourse around trans identity, or maybe more precisely, how they see it used, the ideological weaponization of trans identity.
Right. And that term weaponization, it's important to stress, as the author does, how they're using it.
Definitely. They're talking about how ideas and language are being used in the conversation, not about trans individuals themselves.
In fact, they make a point of saying very clearly, trans people are not the problem.
Right, explicitly.
Yeah.
Describes them as siblings in the movement, facing real hatred, real violence, real exclusion, and that we must protect them fiercely. That part is unequivocal.
But then comes the contrast.
Right. The author then criticizes what they see as being constructed around them. Things like slogans, the dogmas, the policing of thought, even, they say, the redefinition of biology, language, and even childhood.
So it's the framework, the surrounding discourse that's being critiqued.
Exactly. The ideas and how those ideas are, in the author's view, being enforced.
And this leads to a really central argument the author puts forward, that this isn't actually about inclusion in their view, but about something closer to dominance.
Dominance.
Yeah, they argue it's about forcing every institution, every child, every teacher, every voice to comply or be labeled a transphobe, suggesting that label is sometimes wielded, to ensure compliance.
Which, the author says, makes certain questions almost impossible to ask. Questions they feel are essential, but have become taboo.
Like what kind of questions?
Well, they list quite a few sensitive ones. What does child transition actually mean? Should teenagers be on hormones that are irreversible? Is gender about the soul or a story or both? What about lesbians who prefer female bodies? What about single-sex spaces like shelters or sports? Language, privacy.
These are definitely hot-button issues.
Hugely. And the author's point is that just raising them often gets shut down.
So the conclusion for this part is that difficulty in asking questions turns pride into a kind of battleground.
Yeah, a battleground for control where nuance just disappears. Nuance dies is the phrase they use. Thinking about your own observations, does that description of the discourse ring true at all for you? Okay, so moving on from that picture of the West as a sort of battlefield, the author then introduces this idea of false prophets operating within the movement itself.
False prophets.
Yeah. They describe these as people, or maybe groups, who are, in the author's opinion, turning identity into ideology, turning compassion into coercion.
How do they mean coercion? What does that look like according to the text?
They give examples like people who speak in hashtags, who cancel dissent, who accuse faster than they listen. It's a critique of certain tactics, you see.
I see. Tactics perceived within the movement.
And there's a really striking metaphor the author uses here. They argue some people are using the trans flag, which should be about dignity, about protection, to build a kind of fortress. And from behind those walls, the author claims they declare war.
War. On who?
Well, this is the provocative part. The author says, not on homophobes, but on feminists. Not on bigots, but on thinkers. They frame it as a war against complexity, against open debate, even against science, in their view.
Wow. Okay. And connected to this, the author also brings up corporations, right?
Yeah, that's a big theme, too.
Right.
That companies have piled in, basically. But not because they care, but because rainbow capitalism sells.
So pride in the West risks just becoming a brand. Is that the idea?
That's the concern raised, yeah. Just another marketing opportunity. And the author draws a sharp line right after that. They say, truth. Truth doesn't fit in a brand kit. Truth doesn't sell easily.
Because truth can be uncomfortable.
Exactly. It can offend, it can disturb, but, the author adds, it can also liberate.
Which leads to a pretty direct call to action in the text. Reclaim pride.
But they're very specific about who from.
Right. Not from trans people, they reiterate.
Crucially. But from those who have made their identity into a dogma that allows no dissent. From those who have used our history of pain to silence reason.
It's a strong critique. So thinking about your own experiences, how does that assessment of rainbow capitalism, of this alleged dogma, how does that sit with your perspective on pride these days?
Okay, so after laying out those challenges seen in the West, the author then does something quite interesting. They shift the focus dramatically towards Asia, a region, the author points out, that's often overlooked in Western LGBTQIA+ narratives.
Ah, okay. And what do they see happening there?
Well, it's presented as a real contrast. While the West is seen as stuck in ideological confusion, the author finds something remarkable happening in the East.
Remarkable how?
They describe it as happening quietly, proudly, honestly, and they give concrete examples.
Such as?
Well, Thailand, for instance, known for its visible transgender community, right? The author notes it's now moving towards legalizing same-sex marriage, seeing real political will, but also, importantly, still asking the hard questions about healthcare, dignity, legal rights alongside that progress.
Okay, so progress, but grounded practical questions, too.
Exactly. Then there's Taiwan, first in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. The author sees this as inspiring the whole region with courage and, significantly, democratic clarity.
Democratic clarity. Interesting phrasing.
And Vietnam gets mentioned, too, specifically for having depathologized transgender identity.
Meaning?
Taking it out of the realm of medical or mental disorder classification. The author views Vietnam as building new frameworks that try to blend cultural roots with progressive steps.
So across these examples, what's the author's main point?
They stress that progress isn't perfect in these places, obviously, but they argue it's grounded.
Grounded.
Yeah. And crucially, this approach, in the author's view, doesn't cancel people. It doesn't silence discussion. And most importantly, it doesn't force ideology on children in the name of inclusion. That's their interpretation of what's happening there.
So the takeaway from Asia, according to the author, is that you can be progressive without dogma, protect minorities without erasing biology, celebrate gender without denying sex.
That's the possibility the author holds up, yes. Yeah. Based on these examples.
Which leads them to that pretty pointed suggestion.
Maybe, just maybe, we need to stop lecturing the world and start learning from it.
It's provocative. Thinking about that comparison, how does this perspective on progress in Asia, as the author describes it, maybe shift your view on how the LGBTQIA+ movement is evolving globally? And as we get towards the end of the text, it feels like the author's personal voice comes through more strongly, doesn't it?
Very much so. It's clear they're not just, throwing stones from a distance. They root it in personal experience.
Yeah, remembering feeling unseen, remembering what pride felt like maybe earlier on, when it wasn't so corporate.
When it was more about protest, survival, love even.
And they really try to articulate what they see as the original promise of pride. What was that core message?
It was simple but profound. You are not alone. Your story matters, you are seen.
And to get back to that, to truly see each other again within the community, what does the author say needs to happen?
Well, the line that jumps out is, we must stop blinding ourselves with ideology.
Stop the blinding ideology.
Yeah. And connected to that is a real emphasis on listening. Listening again.
But listening how?
Not just to the loudest, the author urges, but to the wisest. And maybe most interestingly, listening to the current beneath the current, looking deeper than the surface noise.
And they bring in that quote, right, attributed as after Martin Luther King Jr.
That's right. The greatest threat to justice is not the hatred of the loud, but the silence of the reasonable.
And the author seems to align their own reflections with that idea, encouraging reasonable voices to speak up.
It feels that way. The whole tone of this section is quite reflective, human, grounded. It feels like a search for honesty, even if that honesty is uncomfortable. So, if we were to boil down the author's core message from this whole piece, what would it be?
I think it comes down to that phrase, pride needs a course correction.
It needs direction, not just colors.
Yeah. And the author really pushes this idea of moving forward with clarity, walking what they call the most honest one.
Even if that path involves facing inconvenient truths.
Right. Even if it means, as they put it, walking with fewer followers, but with open eyes.
It's a call for a different kind of pride, perhaps. Thinking about everything this author has put forward. What stands out most powerfully to you from this particular deep dive into their perspective on pride today?
And maybe one last thought to leave you with, building directly on the author's argument. If, as they suggest, pride needs more direction, more honesty, rather than just, displaying colors, what specific action or maybe just reflection does that call for in your own engagement, both with the month itself and the wider conversation? What might walking that most honest path, as the author describes it, actually look like for you in this context?